who are in the audience today, who again, you may not see on Zoom, but are with us nonetheless. Deborah Wagoner. She's a global government affairs professional who many of us know and love, and a one-time chair of the Trade Committee of the National Foreign Trade Council. Alice Slayton-Clark, a VP for International Investment and Trade Policy at the U.S. Council for International Business. David Salmonson, Senior Director for Government Affairs at the American Farm Bureau Association, and Eric O'Toole of Barlow and Company. Welcome, Deborah, Alice, David, and Eric, and delighted to have you join us today. As we welcome on camera our next expert panel to provide some context to one of America's most critical global relationships. Some of you may know that Saturday kicked off celebrations of the Chinese Lunar New Year. 2024 is the year of the dragon. And we have a fantastic panel today to discuss some of the fiery issues in U.S.-China trade relations. Again, you can find all their biographies online, but that we emailed you today. But welcome on screen Anna Ashton, Director of China Corporate Affairs and U.S.-China and the Eurasia Group. Excuse me for fumbling my words there for a second, Anna. Jamieson Greer, a partner with King & Spalding and a former USTR Chief of Staff. Jeremie Waterman, President of the China Center at the Vice President Greater China at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Our moderator, Tim Keeler, partner and co-leader of international trade at Mayer Brown, and also a former USTR Chief of Staff. And we're still expecting on screen, but he hasn't logged in yet, Paul Triolo, an associate partner there he is. He's got Tim Keeler's link. We'll fix that, so that's fixed later. Apologies. Associate partner for China and Technology Policy Lead at the Albright Stonebridge Group and Dentons Global Advisors. We'll take care of fixing that for you, Paul. There you go, Paul Triolo. Appreciate it. Good to see you, my friend. Thank you all for joining us. And Tim, take it away.
Thanks, Ken. Thanks, everyone. I myself had a login problem, so I'm using my phone. So apologies if the camera looks a little odd, but we've got a great panel for folks here. As Ken mentioned, we've got Anna Ashton, who is not only at the Eurasia Group, but formerly of the U.S.-China Business Council. Paul Triolo, who spent 25 years in the U.S. government. Jamieson Greer, who, as Ken noted, was in, perhaps what is among the most important and powerful positions in the U.S. government, that being Chief of Staff at the U.S. Trade Representative's Office, and Jeremie Waterman, who has been a stalwart on these issues at U.S. Chamber of Commerce for many years now, but is also a USTR alum. So it's really a fantastic panel. I'm going to kick it off with having Anna Ashton and then Paul discuss geopolitical and trade issues right now in the U.S.-China relationship. And then we'll turn to Jamieson and Jeremie to talk about China political issues, of which there are many. And we've got, I think, 50 minutes total. We'll try to get some to questions, both from myself and from audience members. And so looking forward to the discussion. Anna, let me turn it over to you.
Sounds good. Thanks. So I wanted to start off with a little bit of an overview of where things are in the China market right now. Hopes were high for a robust Chinese economy after the zero COVID policies were lifted, but that clearly didn't materialize the way that people thought that it might. And it's become increasingly evident that China's economic prospects are tethered to some pretty hard to resolve structural problems that are going to continue to drag on the country's recovery. Financial fragilities have been exposed. The property sector crisis is dragging on and is going to drag on. The stock market continues to have challenges. And, perhaps most significant is flagging domestic consumption, which is indicative of the persistent lack of popular confidence in China's near-term economic prospects. We're past the window for a zero COVID rebound. And while Beijing is continuing to try to restore confidence domestically and prop up demand by throwing money at the problems, its efforts are going to have limited impact in the absence of a true shift towards bold reform, which we don't have real signs that we're likely to see. Foreign investors are diversifying their investments to balance out China risks like worsening regulatory compliance challenges, uncertainties over the primacy of growth or security in Chinese policy, questions about the prospects for the private sector amid a resurgence of support for the public sector, and persistent geopolitical differences that continue to feed de-risking efforts in the United States, Europe, and a number of other countries. All of this has made for something of a positive change in US-China relations. Beijing has been more amenable to coming to the table to at least establish communication or more solid communication with Washington in the last several months. And we've seen the two sides establish something like a tactical truce. That is probably going to persist through this year. We give it about an 80% chance of persisting through this year, both because the White House is under pressure to demonstrate effective management of China, not just tough on China policy, but effective management to avoid conflict, and because China can't afford to not be courting foreign direct investment, including US foreign direct investment. Moreover, the prospects for improving the relationship in a significant, material way may be slim under the Biden administration, but there is even more uncertainty if there's not a second Biden administration. So this is a limited window for China to sort of entrench new dialogues and try to get the relationship stabilized. Stability is in both sides' best interest. So we think that that's how things will play out through 2024, but 2025 creates a whole new set of questions. And maybe I will pause there, pass it to Paul.
Great. Paul.
Oops.
Cool, thanks. Great the comments on it, and happy to be on and with my esteemed colleagues, particularly Jeremie. So Anna mentioned that that the administration was grappling with managing the relationship and not just avoiding conflict. I think that technology is one of these areas that's going to continue to dog the relationship. So let me just touch on sort of the way we think about this. We work with a lot of clients in the tech sector, so we're working this on a daily basis, fielding questions about what's next. We're getting a lot of questions now on how a Trump administration would handle some of these things. But I think it's clear that technology will remain at the center of the bilateral relationship. It was put there by Secretary Blinken in a May 2022 speech. And since that time, of course, we've seen a lot of measures taken by different parts of the US government on the technology in the technology arena. So I think that the framework we prefer to use, and it's still certainly workable, is some of the comments coming from National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan in September, October, November of 2022. I call this the Sullivan Doctrine. This is things like small yard high fence that you're probably all familiar with, the U.S. maintaining an absolute lead in the technology space. And then he also called out these three sectors, advanced compute, biotech, and green tech, as sort of these pillars of the economy and of key concern to U.S. national security. And I think he called them force multipliers. So since that time, we've seen a lot of policies come down the pike. We of course had the export control package on October 7th, which was fairly unprecedented in its scope and depth. And it was updated, of course, in October of 2023. In the biotech space, I think a little more slow to develop, but we do have, for example, a new data security executive order coming out shortly, which touches on data transfers involving things like genomic data and healthcare data, and sort of growing concern around biotech companies in China and what they're doing. And then green tech, which is of course the EV space, with a lot of discussion there about dependence on China in terms of supply chains for EV batteries, and talk about new tariffs on those supply chains and maybe on EVs. So that framing is something that we're dealing with a lot, because we have a lot of companies that are caught in one element or another of those pillar technology sectors, which are pretty broad if you look at the complete package there. So for example, advanced compute really includes semiconductors, semiconductor manufacturing equipment, AI, and quantum computing. And that can cover a whole range of things. So we do have this temporary, arguably thaw in the relationship, which Anna alluded to, coming out of the November Biden-Xi meetings, the recommitment to the Bali process, and lots of dialogues back and forth. Jeremie is well familiar with these, the working groups, the finance and economic working groups with the Treasury Department, and of course the commercial issues working group. And then there's also a notional AI working group that will tackle some element of AI regulatory policy that's out there. So all good signs. But at the same time, as we look forward, I think we got a lot of potential other measures coming up that we deal with, and we're trying to understand between now and November, because there is the sense that the Biden administration wants to continue to be tough on China, be seen as tough on China, with Trump weighing in regularly on issues now. I think there's even more pressure to appear tough on China. So in the coming weeks, for example, we'll see a lot of different measures. We'll see new export controls, for example, that there have been some media reports that we could see the inclusion, for example, of RISC-V, the open architecture for chip design, included companies or organizations involved in RISC-V included on the entity list. There may be other Chinese companies added to the entity list around things like legacy semiconductors. And we could see tightening of licenses around some key players in China. So that's going to happen probably sooner rather than later. We've also got the outbound investment executive order, the rule for that coming pretty soon. I think it could be as early as next week. That's been in the making for a while. That came out in August of last year. So that, again, that outbound investment is focused narrowly on technology areas, AI, semiconductors, and quantum computing. And then we have this new data security executive order, which will probably come out also within the next couple of weeks. I think the administration is trying to sequence these measures with the ongoing bilateral dialogues, with the Chinese New Year, with upcoming other dates in the Chinese calendar, the NPC in early March, for example. So there's a lot of orchestration and choreography going on here around when to release some of these policies, because we would expect, for example, Beijing to react. And I'll get to that in a second. And then finally, in terms of measures, we also have a new implementing rules coming out around the ICATS supply chain rule. This is if you may remember your executive orders, that's Executive Order 13873, which was never really implemented. BIS now has a special office to implement that rule, and we'll probably see something coming soon around connected vehicles and ADAS systems. So again, that will all likely involve a heavy China nexus for the first set of rulemaking around that, or implementation of those rules coming out of the ICATS supply chain executive order. And so for our companies, then finally, what happens then is they're increasingly caught in this crossfire between U.S. measures, for example, and compliance, and then of course the Chinese reaction to this. And so over the next few months, we're looking at a whole range of issues. One is, as Anna noted, the economic slowdown in China, and then the difficult policy environment in China that companies are facing. Jeremie, I assume we'll touch on this as we go forward. And then also, again, the changing goalposts of some of these technology rules. The industry is very concerned that the administration has been changing the goalposts on that, so they're grappling with that too. And then the Beijing's retaliation function, I think, is really tricky to assess. Last year, for example, for the first time, they rolled out the unreliable entities list. They targeted Micron for a cybersecurity review. So there was clearly a retaliation function in China that has been evolving and gaining steam. They put some critical minerals, for example, on export control lists. Graphite, gallium, and germanium, and so that's another big issue that companies are dealing with in China, and they're dealing with both the sort of Chinese response in terms of industrial policy and changing measures in some sectors like semiconductors. They're also dealing with targeted Chinese retaliation of the type that we saw last year, and then there's a whole other host of sort of behind-the-scenes internal guidance issues that companies are dealing with that are also in part related to U.S. measures, responses, the Chinese government, guidance on procurement and all of those other things that are much more difficult to track. Their internal guidance, the Chinese government won't acknowledge them, and it's difficult to raise those in some of these bilateral dialogues, for example. And so companies are dealing with a lot of challenges in China around technology issues in particular, and things like supply chains. And then finally, we've been getting a lot of companies coming to us around Taiwan and Taiwan risks. I'm not sure to the extent to which you've discussed Taiwan before previously, but we're having companies in many sectors come to us, and we're doing a lot of Taiwan risk management scenarios where we get deep under the hood and understand their supply chains in China and try to come up with scenarios around disruption of those, short of course, of a full military action around Taiwan. But companies are increasingly concerned that issue could really be disruptive, particularly in industries like IT, across IT sectors and semiconductor sectors, where any kind of action around Taiwan would have catastrophic consequences for those sectors. So, in any case, that's as we look forward to the election, I think we're going to see more U.S. government actions, and we're going to see some retaliation, very carefully measured by China to some of these things, as the administration manages the relationship and tries to avoid where we were a year ago, which was in a pretty bad state. But I think the uncertainty here is, as I think Anna mentioned too, around the election in November. What happens then? How do some of these policies change or not? And how should companies think about what we might see depending on whatever happens in November? We get a major change, or we have more of the same. So let me stop there, and happy to take questions as we go.
Thanks. Those both of you really fantastic overview of really all the geopolitical and economic issues going on between the U.S. and China, and that's your last comments, Paul, are a great segue into perhaps as you mentioned, we're in a political election year. So Jamieson, let me kick it off to you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, everybody. And appreciate the comments from Anna and Paul talking about the China situation, and then Paul going over some of the measures that we have going on and some that might be coming down. I think that's really helpful and granular. I do want to talk. I want to take just a little bit of a step back, I think, and talk about some of the U.S. policy dynamics really underlying what's driven all the measures Paul was talking about, and the ones that might come forth. Obviously, some of this is not going to be new to a lot of you who are on the phone, but I think it's just important to kind of realize that when we talk about preferred policy prescriptions regarding the U.S.-China economic relationship, it really depends on one's assessment of the challenges or the opportunities presented by China. And I'm going to kind of simplify this to really talk about kind of two camps or something like that. It's really a spectrum, right? I mean, policymakers are on a spectrum, but I think there are kind of two camps, at least for our purposes, we can think about it. There's the first camp who kind of view China as, frankly, an existential threat, right, to our economy or our national security, or both. And the view is that this justifies strong and broad measures to protect economic and national security, even if there might be some economic costs, right? And this view is really based on the idea that China has been focused on its own so-called decoupling from the U.S. and the West for many years, seeking to import only what it really needs and seeking to dominate its domestic market and international markets in the most strategic sectors. And none of that's really a secret. Folks in this camp, I would say, they tend to feel strongly about the need to manufacture in the United States, tend to be concerned about the forces that have resulted in decades of U.S. trade deficits in goods in particular. And so from an economic perspective, certainly a lot of folks would say that this camp is protectionist. Folks in this camp would probably call themselves pragmatists or realists. And then to be clear, there's also a security lens to this. There are folks in this camp who really just have strong concerns regarding China's increased militarism, right? Its buildup of conventional and strategic capabilities, combined with its assertion of authority and territorial disputes in Taiwan, India, Japan, South China Sea, and elsewhere. So that's kind of that group. And then you have another camp that, again, I think is thoughtful about these things. And their view tends to be that China is not 10 feet tall, and we shouldn't think of it as such, and that there might actually be some danger or harm to the United States in overestimating any threat posed by China. Some in this camp may also think that Chinese unfair trading practices, while bad, might be managed, and if they should be addressed, should be done so in a way that's really narrow, maybe consistent with WTO obligations and general principles of non-discrimination. And some in this camp might also seek to put into context China's military buildup, saying that this is kind of consistent with rising powers and that kind of thing. And I think that folks in this camp also have some concern that taking strong trade or economic measures to counter China's unfair trade or national security concerns can actually lead the United States to take actions or activities that might be contrary to perceived norms of the liberal international order. And this camp might also believe that there are ways to really work with China in areas of common concern, whether it's climate or other things, and that taking strong economic measures in one area could jeopardize these efforts in other areas. To be totally transparent, I'm not entirely good at describing the views of this last camp because I'm not really in it. I'm more in the first camp. But I think that it's fair to kind of describe where folks sit, and again, it's really on a spectrum. But I think if we can understand these different kind of conceptions of the challenges or opportunities posed by China, gives us more insight into what kind of policies might be coming down the pike and where compromises might need to be made as we kind of work through our own political system on these issues. I think too, just to note, I think it's meaningful that there are kind of two camps here and that they're discussing in a very public way how to best mitigate risk related to China, right? Because first of all, it assumes that there is risk. And it's a discussion that really has taken center stage here in Washington. And this is something that, I think before 2016, 2015 wasn't the case. There were certainly folks concerned and talking about it. I mean, people on this, call, a lot of them have been thinking about it for a long time. But it's really on center stage now. And, discussion and use of new tools is at play in a way that wasn't before, right? I mean, I think historically everyone relied on anti-dumping countervailing duty laws, WTO rules, and then on the national security side, kind of relatively narrow export controls and sanctions. I mean, think about export control reform in the Obama era, where we were moving controlled items from the U.S. military list to the looser controls of the Export Administration Regulations. So we're really in a different place. And maybe I'll comment a little bit later on how the discussion on outbound investment really shows how these two camps think about things. But again, even there, it's not even really a partisan divide on this viewpoint. It's really a policy divide, I would say. There are folks in the Republican Party who are at odds. There are folks in the Democratic Party who have different views on this. So the question is, given this kind of setup and context, what's next here? Again, kind of hearing Paul talk about everything that's been done, everything that might be coming down, my sense is that a camp that's in favor of a more hawkish view, or whatever you want to call it, is ascendant in Washington. The Biden administration has maintained a lot of these Trump-era policies, and the putative GOP nominee has expressed an interest in raising tariffs on China. And there are a lot of other creative ideas out there, right, about SEC disclosures about China risk or Taiwan risk, de minimis reform for imports from China, potential renegotiation of trade agreements to account for content from China, and then preparing for the possibility of a sanctions regime in case there's any kind of kinetic action by China at some point. When it comes to companies and what they're doing, I mean, the companies I'm dealing with are trying to be pretty pragmatic about this. Many of them are looking to diversify supply chains out of China as a general matter. I do get the sense that there are some companies that are continuing to invest. And I think that the reason they're doing this is because they think their sectors are kind of insulated either from trade tensions or based on their sector. That being said, no one really feels completely insulated because they can be collateral in the event of collateral damage in the event of retaliatory actions, by either China or the United States. And frankly, really the folks we're dealing with right now, they're struggling with figuring out, how do I comply with U.S. law while not angering Chinese officials, and vice versa, right? And then on top of that, they're also trying to figure out, how do I triangulate vis-a-vis my competition, right? If I exit China or I give up that market for a variety of reasons, am I going to be backfilled by somebody else? Is someone else going to come in and take that and benefit because they have a higher risk tolerance? And so they're thinking, what are measures that can be taken to make sure that everyone's kind of taking the same risk approach? I think, from my perspective, ideally, I think we would want to get to a situation where the U.S. and China are actively managing their trade. I know that term is kind of anathema to free trade fundamentalists, but to the extent there are areas of non-sensitive trade where China and U.S. can still do business, perhaps it makes sense to identify those areas and work toward it. I mean, as long as you have one side that's always been managing its trade for decades, and one that has not, that one side's going to be at a disadvantage, and that's not really politically or economically sustainable for the U.S. But of course, in all this, China has agency, and so even if U.S. policymakers are able to agree on the appropriate level of trade and openness toward China, that doesn't mean that China is going to agree. But I think it's worth the time for both China and the United States to kind of figure out where those lines sit.
Great, thanks. Jeremie, why don't you?
So thank you, Tim. Great pleasure, honor to be on this panel with a group of very distinguished experts. I'm not sure how much is left to be said at this point. A lot has been said. I agree with much of what has been said. I'll say for business first. Business overall is very sober, very level-headed about where we are with China these days. Look, that's not to say perfect knowledge, perfect understanding across the board, but I think overall far greater understanding and appreciation in the boardroom, in the C-suite, and on down through GR, compliance, and so forth across the board when it comes to China. Clearly, and I talk about 4 or 5 body blows to U.S.-China relations. Obviously, COVID was one. China's support for Russia was another. The 4th Taiwan crisis was yet a third. Xi Jinping's emphasis on security over growth and development and all that entailed and continues to entail was yet another wake-up call. And certainly now, I think when you talk to many companies, and certainly if you pick up a newspaper, many are looking at the prognosis for the Chinese economy now, in the near term, the medium term, and even the long term, and have real questions about whether the policies that are being pursued and policy making, the consistency of policy making, whether that is a recipe for sustained growth in the Chinese economy. Obviously, the Chinese economy is huge. It is the world's 2nd largest economy. It's many economies. If you look at across regions and provinces, you have some that are still growing at a healthy clip, and you have others that probably have substantially negative growth. So it is a complicated picture. And look, China remains a critical market for many companies. There's just and the recent AmCham Business Climate Survey underscores that. EU Business Climate Surveys, Japan. I mean, there's no getting away from 1.3 billion people. If you're selling consumer goods, if you're selling agriculture, do we really want China getting all of its energy going forward from Russia and the Middle East? I think look, China is if you are a licensor to the consumer electronics industry, if you're not going to license to China, who are you going to license to, right? So I think there are just a lot of questions that need to be thought through when it comes to and hard realities in terms of the importance of the China market for many businesses across sectors. Again, that said, and to pick up where I started, there's real sobriety about where we are with China, about legitimate national security concerns when it comes to China. I think business understands that 2024, I think Anna and Paul highlighted this, will be a year of largely defending the status quo. I think business is on some level resigned to increased security measures focused on countries of concern, including China. I think we're pleased that this administration is not that it always gets it right or is always getting it right, but it is trying to scope measures in a targeted way, and it is providing extended processes for notice and comment. So what we saw with the outbound investment EO and the ensuing ANPRM will move to a proposed rule Paul mentioned, and then ultimately a final rule, but that's going to hopefully be at least an 8-month or even year-long process, right? With multiple opportunities for comment. We're going to see something similar on the data EO, I believe, which we'll see here, which Paul alluded to, where that will kick off again a process, probably a similarly lengthy process of consultation, of input, and so forth. So we do have an opportunity to explain to the administration the downsides and that these policies are appropriately balanced to consider, the national security concern, but also lost business and even lost competitiveness and even potential boomerangs on U.S. national security. These are very complicated issues and need to be thought through. Again, to the point of where business is, I think business generally understands the need for an outbound investment screening regime. I think there's an understanding for, that, some types of early stage investments into China probably should not be taking place. I think there's also an a view that, a sanctions-based approach is not the right way to do that. I think, again, business is pretty sober. I think agree with the comments that the administration is not inclined, if it has its way, to rock the boat with Beijing, as President Biden does deal with his reelection. There are crises, obviously, that continue to unfold in Europe and the Middle East, and the last thing we need is a spark in Asia, right? And to have a third front here right now. That said, I think there's also, as Paul laid out well, there's a recognition the administration is going to move forward with a series of actions on the competitive agenda. He ticked off a bunch of those. Obviously, we're all waiting for the 4-year review of the Section 301 tariffs. I'm not sure that any of those, certainly Chinese retaliation is something that we watch closely. And I would say that, the dial on some level, if retaliation is a dial, the dial in Beijing is always on the on. It's always turned on, but I'm not sure that any of these actions would be viewed by Beijing as major muscle movements. If we look at, a relatively narrowly scoped data security EO, for example, when we compare that to China's rather draconian regime with regard to regulating data flows, for example, I think, hopefully China will understand, although I certainly would not bet my house on it, but obviously there has to be, every country has a right to look after, bulk sensitive data. Certainly Beijing looks after a lot more than just bulk sensitive data. I would just say with regard to the Hill environment, I think, there's a lot of proposals out there, but it's challenging, I think, as we all know, to legislate when the Congress is divided. There are also intra-party differences when it comes to a range of issues. Obviously, outbound investment legislation is one of those issues, and there are other differing viewpoints. And so I suspect the discussion and the examination will continue through this year. But I think that the baseline case, and certainly the business community is watching very closely, but I'm not sure we expect some of these, challenging issues to get resolved or to necessarily move forward this year. I agree very much with Paul. I think two big challenges going forward for business. One is the broad technology competition, which Paul spoke about, I think, quite comprehensively. The other one is overcapacity from China, or what we call ultra overcapacity. We are on the eve of 2025, and as we look back to Made in China 2025, I think we can say that China has executed and exactly what it said it would do in the Made in China 2025 policy and in the Green Book that underpins Made in China 2025. So the fact that we now see significant overcapacity, brewing across a range of sectors, and is, I think, not a surprise if we take Beijing at its word. Beijing has largely executed, and obviously that overcapacity, particularly the downstream overcapacity, is going to present a variety of challenges when we think about not so much supply, but demand. The demand for legacy semiconductors, for example, what that means for scale going forward, what that means for efficiency and price. To the extent China is monopolizing or disproportionately occupying a very substantial role in global supply chains and demand for certain products that incorporate legacy semiconductors, that's going to be, a significant issue for, I think, U.S. policymakers and, of course, for U.S. business as well going forward, as the government considers responses that have collateral damage, including for business. So I think, look, business welcomes this respite. I think very pleased that the two governments are talking to one another in a variety of fora. We're hopeful that the current pause in tensions will yield some improvements in the business climate in China. To be straight, we have not seen meaningful or tangible improvements in the business climate. We see a fair amount of talk. Obviously, delegations going to Davos. We're back. We're open for business, but we see a continuing emphasis on security inside China. I do think the Chinese are working hard to maintain the investment that they do have in the market. So I think many companies do report that they are, issues that they try to get resolved are being attended to in the market. But in terms of new market opening, in terms of ongoing industrial policies in sensitive areas, as Paul mentioned, we are not seeing, improvements. Obviously, hope that maybe the upcoming vice ministerial of the Commercial Issues Working Group can touch on some of those issues, but I think expectations are modest. And I think we'll see if the Chinese, as they deal with a faltering economy and negative FDI for the first time in many years, we will see if there is a willingness to make some material changes that would actually improve the business environment, as well as curb this overcapacity, which is sadly going to fuel another round of tensions, not only with the U.S., but with also many of China's other trading partners. So I'll leave it there and look forward to the Q&A.
Thank you. Let me just note to our audience, please do send in questions. We do have one. Let me kick things off and pose a question to Anna along the lines of what Jeremie said, because at the end there, the economic. Everybody who's been working on China for decades now, it's been in the context of a fast-growing China. Now, what you mentioned the economic slowdown, and negative, and Jeremie mentioned negative FDI possibility. This is a huge change from what the business community and policymakers, the backdrop. How big of an impact might that have with the U.S.-China relationship, even if it isn't a slight thawing period? It's more of a talking thaw than an action thaw. So, and any quick thoughts you have on that?
Sure. So, of course, it's a big deal. It's never been easy to do business in China, and I would say that the challenges that have evolved in the present day are just the latest challenges. They're different from previous challenges. The concerns over whether or not the Chinese economy is going to grow faster in the near, medium, or long term have to be thought of in context, which is that a 1.3 or 1.4 billion person economy growing, even if it's not growing at the 5% that it says it's growing, if it's growing at 3%, it's still growing a pretty significant amount, and that's a lot of opportunity for business. This has never been a major consumer market in terms of domestic demand, and if domestic demand is down right now, that's not a big change from what is standard in China. There's been a long-held desire to increase domestic demand, but the fact that it hasn't been accomplished yet doesn't change the fact that the possibility presents huge business opportunity. I think the real issue here is that the economic changes are happening in the context of both countries looking at each other as national security threats, as adversaries. And the geopolitics of the relationship make it unlikely that even in a positive economic situation, U.S. companies would be able to fare as well as competitors from other countries, that they would be treated fairly.
Great, thank you. Jamieson, we got the first question in. I'm going to pose to you with one add-on to. What are the most effective trade tools at the U.S.'s disposal to diversify our critical mineral supply chains and become less dependent on China? And then if you could just expand a little bit on your if the U.S. wanted to move towards managed trade, and you described letting non-sensitive trade happen, but of course, who defines what's non-sensitive? It could be in the eye of the beholder, particularly if there's a member of Congress who represents that area. It does consider it sensitive. So if you could just briefly touch on those 2 points.
Sure. On the first question, what trade tools can we use to diversify our critical mineral supply chain from China? We're seeing some of them being tested right now, right? So if you look at the tax credits in the Inflation Reduction Act, if you want to get a tax credit for a clean vehicle, the battery components, and the critical minerals, they can't come from a foreign country or a foreign entity of concern, meaning writ large, a Chinese company. So that kind of concept, you could take that and you could put it into, rules of origin or things like that. There are challenges with that though too, right? I mean, first of all, can you do it like on a cliff like that, right? Or is it the kind of thing you have to phase in? Also, if you want to do that, but you don't have an energy or regulatory domestic policy in the United States that can facilitate that kind of thing, can make it hard, right? I mean, we actually have tons of lithium in the United States. We have huge amounts of lithium, but we don't have processing, right? They have processing in China. So I think, certainly trade tools matter and they're important and they can create, carrots and sticks. But I think you do have to marry it also with, energy policy, tax policy, and different things. I mean, there's just a lot of levers that go into to doing this. I think they all have to be considered. On your other point, if you're trying to have a managed trade situation with China, what do you do, right? I mean, again, I think you saw a tentative at this in the phase 1 agreement with China and the Trump administration, where at least on the U.S. side, it said, hey, here are the kind of things we want to be selling to you. These are the kind of sectors where we want to be selling. And then, I think a lot of the way that the United States draws its lines on our side are through the national security side of things, right? Where we have export controls. We don't want to be selling you this. We don't want to be trading in these ways. But I mean, all of that is a little disjointed, right? There's trade, there's national security, different agencies doing different things. And you're right. I think that it is in the eye of the beholder, and it's a conversation that has to be had. So by no means is it an easy thing to do, but I think the more you can get to figuring out where areas where we can trade without having huge conflagrations, that's better for both sides and more stable, frankly.
Great. Paul, if you could weigh in on the critical minerals
Sure.
issue generally, but one other thing I want you to add on is it's sort of like if we transport it back in time even 10 years, the nature of the baseline of this conversation would be sort of shocking, right? Because I think we'd all agree with what Jeremie described as sort of a pseudo thaw that's happening right now. And there's a pseudo thaw, and we're about to have, these multiple executive orders or rulemakings putting into place executive orders, and regulations on IRA implementation that identify FEOCs. Every single one of these are clearly either they name China explicitly, or it's obvious the whole thing is about China. And 10, 15 years ago on the diplomatic side, that would have been seen as sort of like burning down the diplomatic house with China, that the reaction would be furious. Is this pseudo thaw? I mean, everything you described is public. I should say it's the first I've heard maybe outbound rules go pop next week. Besides that, obviously at this point, the Chinese have they sort of diplomatically baked this in the cake? Are they sort of accepting writ large all of these things, or
Good question.
In fact, is it going to be a rockier year, even though they may not want the Biden administration may not want it to be a rocky year?
Great question. Let me just quickly tackle critical minerals, just to add on to the great comments from Jamieson. We work with a lot of companies in the sector, so we've done a lot of deep dives into some of the risks around critical minerals. And it's important to note that there are like 70 critical minerals, and they all have different supply chains and different complexities. So I would just say that there's the two of most importance are EV battery supply chains. And there you're talking about lithium and cobalt and graphite and others. And then there's the rare earths. And both of those have very different approaches to try to solve the dependency. And the critical thing to remember is it's not just about mining and processing. A lot of the areas where Chinese companies lead by 10 years in some cases is in producing the final product, producing that rare earth magnet or producing that graphite anode. And there it's much more difficult to see trade policy sort of making a difference there. There has to be some incentives for industry. So when I talk to a guy who I regularly about the rare earths industry, he's saying, hey, you need $300 billion worth of incentives over a 15-year period to make a dent on rare earths, right? Because companies are competing with much lower cost Chinese counterparts, and the Chinese have a vertically integrated industry that controls, not just the mining and the processing, but really critically that sort of IP at the end use. And by the way, Chinese government is aware of this and will likely see more controls put in place to control IP related to processing of critical minerals. They've already got a number of those on their export control list. And so it's a tricky thing to solve because this is a 10 or 15-year problem to incentivize industry, get a public-private partnerships going to actually make a dent in all this stuff. And particularly critical minerals, particularly the rare earths is tough. The EV battery supply chains, I think, is more tractable. That technology is changing more rapidly. New solid-state batteries are coming. Chinese companies are very innovative in all those spaces, though. And just today, I was reading about a calcium-based battery that China is working on. They've set up a consortium on solid-state batteries. They'll probably be the first to really commercially go with scaled production of solid-state batteries. So it's a really tough uphill battle here on all the materials fronts, and particularly for EV batteries. And I'm not sure that we can have an EV sector in the U.S. by excluding Chinese companies from that battery space for the next decade, because 15 of the top 20 companies making batteries are Chinese. On the sort of broader issue that you raised there, and remind me again on you're talking about in the last how things have changed in the last 10 years, but I forgot sort of the specific thread there. Although I had an answer already.
Well, very quick because we're short on time. It's have the Chinese internalized? Do you think they're fully internalized with all these EOs and regs targeted them coming down the pike in 2024?
Yeah, I mean, I think that to some degree they sort of written off certain elements of U.S. policy, right? They don't think that the U.S. is going to roll back, for example, export control. So that's what I was alluding to. The response function is complicated because in that, like on semiconductors and manufacturing equipment, they're putting in place a whole new strategy and a whole new industrial policy around the semiconductor industry. And I have a paper out in a couple of weeks which will go into great depth on that. But suffice to say, they're going to be developing more sophisticated government private sector partnerships, allowing companies access to R&D, and so they're going to pursue a whole range of new approaches to the semiconductor industry. So at the same time as they're pushing back, there'll be a lot of rhetoric coming out of Beijing when there are new export control measures or new companies added to the entity list. But they're sort of expecting that. They're expecting more companies to be added. So they won't be surprised by that. So I agree with Jeremie that individually, all of these different actions aren't going to generate a response. But I think in general, the Chinese government has sort of is assuming that a lot of these things are going to come down the pike. They may react in a targeted way with some of those measures I mentioned earlier. Dialing up things like they did very cleverly last year by targeting companies like Micron, which has a fairly important but small market presence in China, and that's still murky at exactly how much market share Micron will lose, for example. But they've chosen their retaliatory targets very carefully, so they don't have a big impact on their domestic economic goals. And so that's what we'll be seeing coming up. Targeted reactions, small, but nothing that either upsets the relationship or damages their economy.
I think we have less than a minute, and I think you had a critical minerals point, and then Jeremy, maybe you could just address quickly the two questions from the audience we have out there.
I just wanted to echo Jamieson's point that the solution has to involve more than trade. But at the same time, trade is part of a good defense. We need more than just offense. We've got to have a defense. And it may be true that we're in an era where the new normal is managed trade. But we've got to be thinking in a more aggressive way about who our team is going to be, what we want that to look like, who are we willing to partner with, and how. Maybe there's no path to TPP or CPTPP, but what are we willing to consider in terms of working with allies, partners, neighbors? Because while we're not thinking about that, China certainly is.
And Jeremy, real quickly, if you could address the audience questions. One on
look on CPTPP, RCEP, CPTPP. Look, China's thinking about it. Some of what China is doing on data is not so much about making life easier for foreign companies. It is about trying to perhaps accede to CPTPP. I think the Chinese have their own doubts about whether whether the members of CPTPP will allow China to join, particularly given all that they're going to face on overcapacity going forward. I do think China's approach to using, whether it's US FTAs, EU FTAs, and so forth, to circumvent bilateral measures is something that will be looked at in terms of the trade policy agenda going forward, and is going to be certainly a challenge for us in the business community. Obviously, we'd like to see the U.S. government get back in the business of negotiating trade agreements, but as China continues to use sort of such loopholes to circumvent, that's going to be a challenge. On abandoning a large part of climate ambitions, I think, look, there's little question that obviously, if we just let China supply all the world's solar panels, that would be that might help on the climate side, but that's not, the world is not that simple. I think we all know that, and I think the other thing, obviously, China continues to build out tremendous amount of coal-fire plant capacity domestically, and in part because of security reasons. They're moving forward rapidly on renewables as well. Huge installed renewable capacity in China, so give them credit for that. But also, it's not clear. Certainly China's not necessarily, at least for now, pulling its weight. When it comes to coal, and so again, the world is complicated. So it's a fair question, but not a straightforward one to answer.
Great. Well, let me thank all of our panelists. Thank you to Ken for letting us go just a couple minutes over. It's obviously a supremely important topic. We really had 4 just fantastic experts that was literally covering the waterfront of U.S.-China economic, geopolitical relations, and political relations in 53 minutes. So I hope we accomplished our goal, Ken. Thanks to everyone. Let me turn it back to Ken.
Jeremy, I think you gave me the new subtitle for the conference. The world is complicated. And it's something it's a great transition to our next panel. Thank you, Jamieson, Jeremie, Paul, Anna, and Tim. Very grateful to the 5 of you.